New York City, spring 2022. The city was roaring back to life, lights, crowds, and endless possibility. But beneath the glittering surface, danger lurked. In the shadows of celebration, a hidden threat moved silently, targeting the unsuspecting. No one knew a sinister plot was unfolding, ready to shatter lives in the city that never sleeps. His name was Julio Ramirez. He was 25 years old, a kind and gentle soul with a bright future. As a social worker, he had dedicated his life to helping others, working with families and children in Brooklyn. His friends described him as the nicest guy, someone who lit up a room with his warm smile and infectious laugh. On the night of April 20th, Julio decided to go out. He met up with a friend and they headed to the Ritz Bar and Lounge, a popular gay bar in Hell's Kitchen. It was a place known for its lively drag shows and welcoming atmosphere, a sanctuary for many in the LGBTQ+ community. That night was supposed to be like any other. A few drinks, some music, the company of friends. Julio was seen on security footage leaving the bar with a group of men he had just met. He looked happy, at ease. He sent a final text message to his friends, just a string of playful emojis. Then, nothing. Silence. His friends and family called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. The hours stretched into a day, then another. Panic began to set in. This was not like Julio. He was responsible, always in touch. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. Just a few weeks later, another man, John Umberger, found himself in that same part of the city. John was 33, a political consultant from Washington, D.C. in town for work. He was sharp, driven, and deeply loved by his mother, Linda Clary. On May 28th, after a concert, John decided to continue his night out. He too ended up in Hell's Kitchen, visiting the Q, another prominent gay nightclub just blocks from the Ritz. He was alone, enjoying the vibrant scene, a visitor soaking in the energy of New York nightlife. It was the last place anyone would see him alive. Like Julio, John seemed to simply vanish into the night air. His mother, back in their home state of Georgia, grew worried when he missed their daily phone call. He didn't check out of his hotel, he didn't answer his texts. The silence from his end was deafening, a void where her son's voice should have been. Two men, in the prime of their lives, out for a night of fun in the same neighborhood, both disappeared without a trace. Their loved ones were left with a terrifying question, a question that echoed through the empty streets of the early morning. Where were they? The answers, when they came, were more horrific than anyone could have imagined. On April 21st, just hours after he was last seen, Julio Ramirez was found dead in the back of a taxicab on the Lower East Side, miles from where his night began. The cab driver, noticing his passenger was unresponsive, flagged down a police officer. At first, it was a mystery. There were no obvious signs of trauma, no struggle. The initial report suggested a possible overdose, a tragic but not uncommon story in a city of this size. His wallet was gone, his phone was missing, but the full picture was still shrouded in fog. Then on June 1st, John Umberger's body was discovered. He was found in an Upper East Side townhouse, an apartment where he had no business being. The circumstances were eerily similar. No signs of a fight, no clear cause of death. He was far from where he was last seen, and his personal belongings were gone. For Linda Clary, the news was a mother's worst nightmare come true. Her brilliant, loving son was gone, his life cut short in a city he was just visiting. The pain was immense, but it was coupled with a deep, unsettling confusion. How did this happen? Why? The initial police response seemed to treat these as isolated incidents, two separate tragic deaths. But the families weren't so sure. They started digging, looking into bank accounts, trying to piece together their loved ones' final hours. What they found was shocking. In the hours after they disappeared, Julio and John's bank accounts had been completely drained. Thousands of dollars were stolen, transferred using facial recognition features on their phones. This was no simple overdose. This was not a random tragedy. This was a sophisticated, predatory crime. A chilling pattern began to emerge. These were not just deaths, they were homicides. Julio and John had been targeted, drugged, robbed, and then left to die. The very technology in their pockets, designed for convenience and security, had been turned against them, used as a key to unlock their financial lives. A dark and sinister plot was coming into focus, one that preyed on people in places they felt safest. A shadow had fallen over the city's vibrant gay nightlife, and a terrible realization dawned. Julio Ramirez and John Umberger were not the only victims, they were just the first to be found. Julio Ramirez radiated warmth. Born in Honduras, he grew up in Brooklyn, always caring for others. As a social worker, he brought hope and compassion to children and families. Julio found joy and belonging in New York's LGBTQ+ community and was a beloved son, brother, and friend. His light touched everyone. No one could have imagined that this life of compassion would be cut short in such a cruel and senseless way. In suburban Atlanta, Linda Clary's son John was her world. Brilliant, devoted, and always in touch, no matter where work took him. Their daily calls were a cherished ritual, a bond unbroken by distance. In May 2022, John traveled to New York for work, a confident visitor, savoring a brief moment in the city before calling home. Spring 2022 brought a surge of life back to Hell's Kitchen. Julio Ramirez, eager to reconnect, met a friend at the Ritz Bar and Lounge, a familiar safe haven. The night was ordinary, laughter, music, and the comfort of community. Weeks later, John Umberger, visiting from DC, felt the same magnetic pull, ending up at the Q nightclub. Both men sought nothing more than a good time in a place that promised acceptance. Neither could have known that their search for connection would lead them into danger. Inside the Ritz, Julio mingled easily, making new friends as the night wore on. When his companion left, Julio joined a group of strangers, leaving the bar with them just after 3 a.m. He texted friends, unaware he was walking into a trap. Weeks later, John Umberger, alone at the Q, was similarly approached and left with new acquaintances. Both men vanished into the night, trusting the wrong people. There was no struggle, just a quiet betrayal. In the city's heart, their fates were sealed by a false sense of safety. The perpetrators were calculated, blending into the nightlife of Hell's Kitchen. They targeted men who were alone, using charm and friendliness to gain trust. Their method was simple: isolate, befriend, and lure their victims away from the crowd. Each member played a role, one to engage, another to watch, a third to drive. It was a coordinated operation exploiting the openness of these safe spaces. The goal: find a mark, gain his trust, and lead him away without suspicion. The city's promise of connection became the perfect cover for their predatory scheme. Once isolated, the crew offered their victims a drink or drug, laced with powerful sedatives and fentanyl. The intent was total incapacitation, leaving the victim helpless but appearing merely drunk. Julio and John, under the influence, were led away with ease. The drugs masked the crime, turning a night out into a silent abduction. The dosage was a deadly gamble, with the victims' lives treated as collateral. For both men, the chemical betrayal proved fatal. The city's nightlife became the stage for a lethal deception. With their victims incapacitated, the crew's true target was revealed: their digital lives. Using facial recognition or fingerprints, they unlocked phones and accessed banking apps. Money was transferred out in minutes, thousands stolen before anyone noticed. Julio lost $20,000, John over $25,000. The thieves exploited technology meant for security, turning it into a weapon. The crime was swift, silent, and devastating. In the end, the victims were left not just physically harmed but financially ruined. After the money was gone, the final, most callous act of the crime unfolded. The perpetrators now had a problem: an unconscious witness who, if he survived, could identify them to the police. Their solution was as brutal as it was simple. They abandoned their victims, leaving them to die alone. They were treated not as human beings, but as empty vessels, pieces of evidence to be discarded. There was no attempt to get them medical help, no flicker of conscience. The crew's only concern was severing all ties and disappearing back into the city's shadows before the sun came up. their pockets full from their night's horrific work. In Julio Ramirez's case, his body was placed in the back of a taxicab. The driver was told that Julio was drunk and just needed a ride home to his brother's address. The crew paid the fare and vanished. It was a calculated move designed to create distance and confusion. By the time the cab driver realized his passenger was not sleeping but was, in fact, deceased, the criminals were long gone. Julio was found on a quiet street on the Lower East Side, miles from Hell's Kitchen, his life extinguished for the sake of a few $1,000s. He died alone in the back of a stranger's car, a final, heartbreaking indignity. The fate of John Umberger was equally grim. After robbing him, the crew drove him to a luxury apartment building on the Upper East Side. It was the address of a known accomplice, a place they could use as a dumping ground. They carried his unconscious body into the building and left him inside the apartment. They took his phone, his wallet, and his keys, erasing any obvious connection to where he had been. John's body was not discovered until days later, on June 1st, after his mother's frantic calls led police to file a missing persons report. He was left to die in a stranger's home, far from his own hotel, his last moments a complete mystery. This final act of abandonment was the ultimate expression of the criminal's depravity. It demonstrated a complete and utter lack of regard for human life. They did not just rob Julio and John, they erased them. The overdoses were not accidental, they were a direct and foreseeable consequence of the crew's actions. They administered a lethal poison and then walked away, leaving their victims to face the consequences alone. It was this chilling combination of sophisticated robbery and cold-blooded indifference that elevated these crimes from simple theft to murder, sending a wave of terror through the city. When Linda Clary learned of her son John's death, her grief was quickly replaced by suspicion. The official story, a drug overdose, didn't fit the son she knew. Digging deeper, Linda discovered his bank accounts emptied, confirming her worst fears. Refusing to accept a false narrative, she became his voice, determined to uncover the truth. In Brooklyn, Julio Ramirez's family was shattered by his sudden death. The official story didn't add up. Julio was a gentle, responsible social worker, never reckless. His brother Callous was haunted by unanswered questions and a sense of injustice. Discovering Julio's drained bank accounts, the family knew this was no accident. United by loss, the Ramirez family and Linda Clary began their fight for justice, refusing to let silence win. At first, Julio Ramirez and John Umberger's deaths seemed unrelated, just two more tragedies in Manhattan. But their families pushed for answers, uncovering identical patterns, emptied bank accounts, the same bars, and a chilling criminal signature. Detectives soon realized these weren't isolated cases but part of a larger organized attack targeting gay men. As news of the family's suspicions and the similarities between the cases began to circulate, a palpable wave of fear washed over New York's LGBTQ+ community. The initial reports had been tragic, but the emerging truth was terrifying. The very places that were meant to be safe havens, the gay bars and clubs of Hell's Kitchen, were now being seen as hunting grounds. These were not just bars, they were community centers, places of celebration, acceptance and freedom. The realization that predators were moving through these crowds, disguised as friends and wearing welcoming smiles, struck at the heart of the community's sense of security. The feeling of betrayal was profound. The method of the crime was particularly insidious, breeding a new kind of paranoia. It wasn't about avoiding a dark alley or a physical confrontation. The danger began with a friendly conversation, a shared drink, an offer of camaraderie. The very acts of social connection that defined a night out were now fraught with potential peril. People began to look at strangers with suspicion. Was the person buying you a drink being kind, or were they sizing you up as a target? The psychological impact was immense, forcing an entire community to question the social trust that is essential to any nightlife scene. The joy and spontaneity of a night out were being replaced by anxiety and hypervigilance. Community leaders and activists began to sound the alarm, demanding action and answers from the NYPD and city officials. They held town halls, distributed flyers, and used social media to warn people about the ongoing threat. The message was clear: watch your drinks, never leave with strangers, and stick with your friends no matter what. Safety pamphlets appeared in bars, and bartenders were trained to spot the signs of someone being drugged. An informal neighborhood watch system began to form, with patrons looking out for one another, especially for those who seemed overly intoxicated or were being led away by people they didn't seem to know well. The fear was compounded by a painful history. Many in the LGBTQ+ community felt that crimes against them were not always taken as seriously by law enforcement, a lingering wound from decades of neglect and mistrust. There was a growing anger that these predators had been allowed to operate for months, victimizing numerous people before the deaths of Julio and John finally forced the issue into the spotlight. The community was not just scared, it was angry. They were mourning the loss of two of their own, and they were furious that the sanctuaries they had built for themselves had been so brutally violated. They demanded not just protection, but justice. As the NYPD officially connected the murders of Julio Ramirez and John Umberger, investigators started to suspect that the problem was even bigger than they had initially realized. The crew they were hunting was disciplined and prolific, suggesting a level of organization that went beyond a small group of opportunistic thieves. The financial transactions were complex, involving multiple bank accounts and digital payment platforms used to layer and launder the stolen money. This wasn't just a stick-up crew, this was a modern criminal enterprise, a syndicate that had fused street crime with sophisticated cyber fraud. The investigation was expanding, looking for the architects of the scheme, not just the foot soldiers who carried it out. Detectives began to explore the possibility that this New York City crew was part of a larger, national network. The methods were so specific and so effective that it seemed possible they had been taught, shared, or imported from elsewhere. Were there similar crews operating in other major cities, using the same deadly playbook to target vulnerable people in nightlife settings? The question sent a chill through law enforcement agencies across the country. The crime was perfectly adapted to the modern era, exploiting the trust inherent in both social spaces and the technology we carry in our pockets. It was a franchise model for murder and robbery. The theory gained traction as investigators looked back at unsolved cases and previously dismissed reports. They found echoes of the same methods in other incidents that had been written off as accidental overdoses or simple robberies. The use of incapacitating drugs to facilitate theft was not entirely new, but the scale and sophistication of this operation were on another level. The perpetrators had a deep understanding of which drugs to use, how to bypass biometric phone security, and how to move money digitally without being immediately traced. This suggested a shared knowledge base, a criminal conspiracy that was wider and more entrenched than anyone had dared to imagine. The scope of the potential web was daunting. The police were no longer just hunting for a handful of men who frequented Hell's Kitchen bars. They were potentially looking at a multi-state organization with a hierarchy, specialists, and a network of accomplices who helped with everything from acquiring the drugs to laundering the stolen funds. The deaths of Julio and John had pulled back the curtain on a dark and sprawling criminal underworld operating in plain sight. Catching them would require a massive, coordinated effort, one that would test the limits of modern policing and demand a level of interagency cooperation that was rarely seen. The hunt was on, and the stakes could not be higher. With the cases of Julio Ramirez and John Umberger linked and reclassified as homicides, the NYPD launched a full-scale investigation. A task force united homicide, cybercrime, and local detectives, all racing against time. They pored over evidence, retraced the victims' final steps, and scoured security footage for clues. Under intense public and media pressure, the hunt for justice had truly begun. While one team scoured for physical clues, the cybercrimes unit dove into the digital realm. The criminals' use of smartphones left a trail, digital breadcrumbs. Detectives traced transactions through layers of accounts and payment apps. Each step revealed more, peeling back layers of deception. Finally, the digital breadcrumbs led to real names and faces, the breakthrough detectives needed. As digital evidence and surveillance footage converged, detectives made a breakthrough, a name matched to a face, Jaquan Hamilton. Suddenly, the shadowy conspiracy had a face. The crew's structure came into focus, their roles and methods exposed. The faces that smiled at Julio Ramirez and John Umberger were now known, faces of pure evil. With suspects identified and evidence in hand, the NYPD task force prepared to strike. At dawn, officers raided multiple apartments, catching the crew by surprise. The main suspects, including Jaquan Hamilton and Robert DeMaio, were arrested without major incident. The city breathed a sigh of relief as the predators of Hell's Kitchen were finally in handcuffs. The hunt was over, but the fight for justice in the courtroom was just beginning. The arrests ended a terrifying chapter for New York City but began a long legal fight. The accused, including Kenwood Allen and Jaquan Hamilton, faced charges from robbery to murder. For the families, the courtroom is now their battleground, their presence a testament to the lives lost. Justice moves slowly, but the fight continues, ensuring Julio and John are never forgotten. The tragic deaths of Julio Ramirez and John Umberger left a powerful legacy of awareness. Their story exposed new dangers in our digital age, changing how we think about safety, technology, and community. Today, we are more vigilant, protecting each other, demanding justice, and ensuring their lights continue to shine.